For the month of October, we will be focusing on spiritual fruit. You familiar with spiritual fruit, the concept of spiritual fruit? It's a symbolic concept found in our Bible, a concept with obvious symbolism with obvious agricultural roots. The Apostle Paul used the concept of spiritual fruit to describe the character and the attributes of someone who is spiritually mature. Those who are spiritually mature naturally grow and exhibit spiritual fruit. Spiritual fruit includes things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and more. Now, those who are not spiritually mature will have immature or maybe even, rotten fruit. God willing, those of us who honestly follow Christ's teachings will grow healthy spiritual fruit, and growing such fruit is one of the major missions of the church. Is that why you come to church? To experience life in more loving, more peaceful, and more joyful ways? Growing spiritual fruit is symbolic of the spiritual growth process, hopefully a process that we're all involved in at some level. And of course, Paul uses symbolism a lot in his writings. In today's New Testament reading, we hear part of a letter that Paul wrote to a new church in Galatia. And there we heard about spiritual fruit from a little part of that letter. This letter is from the very earliest days of Christianity. Remember, the Christian church predates the New Testament. The church operated for years without the Bible. And since this letter was intended for a specific church, Paul was dealing with some very specific issues, although they're issues that obviously have a much wider significance and have for the church over the years. Paul had started this church in Galatia, which is now in modern Turkey, well before he wrote even this letter. On the map where it says, Mare Interim, that's, of course, the Mediterranean Sea in English. And after starting this church, Paul moves on to start churches and teach the way of Jesus in other cities in Turkey and throughout the Middle East. But not long after Paul leaves, he receives word that things are not going well in Galatia. And Paul is not happy about it at all. So Paul writes what is kind of an angry, passionate, maybe kind of sounds a little exasperated almost to this church. It's a church and its people that Paul knows well. It's not a letter to an individual. Right? This is a letter to a community. And to make things even more interesting, Galatians, even though they're located in Turkey, they're not of Turkish origin. They're not even Middle Eastern. The Galatians were Northern European immigrants of Celtic origin who had migrated from France and Germany to Turkey. Now, this is interesting for those of us who share European heritage, that immigrants who came from Europe were among the very first Christians due to Paul's efforts. Now, Paul didn't care that they were immigrants from Europe. Or if he did, he never mentioned it. What upset Paul the most was that after he left, a group of Christian missionaries had arrived in Galatia from Israel, and they were teaching a version of Christianity that was mostly based on the law of Moses. These well-meaning Christian missionaries were teaching the people of Galatia that they couldn't follow Jesus unless they also followed all the laws of Moses as well. And this made a lot of sense. Jesus, after all, followed the law of Moses. Jesus was Jewish. But Paul rejected this approach because he felt it wouldn't work in the pagan world. The pagans weren't used to all these laws, and he believed firmly that Jesus went well beyond the law of Moses. So that's the big picture. That's the context. And I mention all this because it's difficult to understand this passage, this particular text, if we don't understand the context. The context here is a plea to follow the way of Jesus, which Paul refers to as the way of the Spirit, rather than the law of Moses. That's the context. So, what's more important to you? Faithfully walking a spiritual path of love and trust, or diligently following a set of God's rules? Paul understood where these missionaries were coming from. I mean, that's what Paul had been taught growing up, that faith was about following God's law, the law of Moses. That was what it meant to be Jewish, in many ways. To be God's children is you follow God's law. What else could it be? But based on his personal experiences, Paul had a personal experience with the living Christ. Paul had learned there's something more, there's something deeper, there's something far more meaningful than a set of rules. And this new way of the new way of the Spirit is what Paul called it. And preaching this way of the Spirit is what was really leading to Paul to start all these new churches. Spiritual experiences or encounters with God, encounters with Christ, are a fundamental aspect of Christianity, including our own church. Paul referred to his spiritual transformation, to what it was like to follow Jesus. He referred to it as walking in the Spirit. Walking, he didn't say it this way, my word, walking in love, walking in the spiritual fruits. Paul would teach people to walk in the Spirit, and if they did, he said, you'll grow spiritual fruit. Walk in the Spirit, you'll grow spiritual fruit. This is very compelling, particularly when people met Paul and saw the nature of him, how he was so peaceful and loving. So these teachings really reflected Paul's own spiritual journey. Early in his life, Paul had been a zealous follower of the law of Moses. A Pharisee of Pharisees, he called himself. But no more. Now he walked with Christ. He walked in the Spirit. And Paul had experienced spiritual fruit growing in his own life as a result of his walk. Walking in the Spirit is not the same thing as walking according to the law, although they can kind of look the same. It's kind of a hard point to actually get across. If you think it's a hard point now, imagine how difficult it was for Paul to get across this idea 2,000 years ago. But this is what Paul is trying to convey. It's what's behind the symbolism that Paul is using here. In his letter to the Galatian church, Paul refers to people who are not walking in the Spirit as people who are instead, and people who aren't walking in the Spirit or following the law, were people following after the flesh. So Paul uses this symbolic imagery of flesh, of the body, to represent the opposite of walking in the Spirit, to help him illustrate the distinction. The symbolism of flesh was intended to represent selfishness, self-gratification, at other people's expense, which in general rule are counter both to the law of Moses and to walking in the Spirit or following Jesus. Now, I'm not completely comfortable with this idea of flesh being counter to Jesus and the Spirit. Jesus, after all, was also flesh and blood. But it's the symbolism that Paul chooses. That's okay. And using the symbolism, Paul is really kind of describing 3 levels of spiritual growth or spiritual maturity. The lowest level Paul calls the flesh symbolically. It's all about me. The second level of spiritual maturity Paul calls the law. I better follow the rules. And the highest level Paul calls being Christ-like, walking in the Spirit, growing spiritual fruit. This is the highest level, at least according to this letter. And to a certain degree, his other letters as well. Paul teaches that if we're Christ-like, if we're truly walking in the Spirit, that we'll be able to tell, because spiritual fruit will grow naturally in ourselves and those around us. Now, as I mentioned, Paul is speaking from personal experience. This is not intellectual to Paul. He lived this. Paul had grown up avoiding the flesh by following the law. And when Paul met Jesus, Paul changed drastically. In an instant, Paul was transformed from a person whose best concept of spiritual growth was to carefully follow the law to someone who experienced the eternal presence of God as the Spirit of love, of joy, of peace. Experienced it on a day-to-day basis. Wow, what have I been doing? Following the law all these years. I mean, it was good, but this is the way. Paul's experience of Jesus Christ allowed Paul to live a fuller and more spiritually significant life, a life that became characterized by love rather than by rules and by laws and punishment. If we have not experienced unconditional love ourselves, at least at some level, often the best we can do is to follow the law, to follow the rules. It's a step along the way. It's okay. But now at this point in Paul's life, in his ministry, Paul had had reached, by the grace of God, a level of spiritual maturity that allowed him to experience and live out deep and abiding unconditional love on a day-to-day basis. It was so compelling that people who were searching, people from all walks of life who were trying to grow spiritually were drawn to Paul. And then Paul helped these people set up churches or houses of spiritual growth. And Paul acted as a teacher. Remember, there's no Bible yet. And that's where Paul's letters come in. They become the Bible eventually, or part of it. And that's why we're reading it today, right? To this new church that he set up in Galatia. In his teachings, as a way to describe walking in the Spirit, Paul lists both the fruits of the Spirit, the traits that come from walking in the Spirit, and in contrast, he offers a list about a dozen Greek words as examples of things that, if they're your primary focus, if these things are really what you're all about, that would suggest that you're not walking in the Spirit. This other list, the opposites of the Spirit, of the fruits of the Spirit, are things that Paul refers symbolically as works of the flesh. Works that lead people away from the Spirit, preventing growth of spiritual fruit, preventing spiritual growth in general. Now, admittedly, we don't usually focus on this list of bad things, this list of acts of the flesh, mostly because Paul did not want us to focus on it, and neither did Jesus. Their teachings indicate otherwise. Paul's point was to focus on the Spirit, on growing spiritual fruit, and that will naturally lead you away from the ways of the flesh. You don't have to worry about that. Focusing on fruits of the Spirit is much more useful, much more powerful, and therefore growing fruits of the Spirit has been a focus of our church here in Owosso since our inception. We've never been a church that focused on the rules, have we? No. Since our foundation in the late 1800s, it's not been who we have been. We have been a church based on love, based on walking in the Spirit. To the best of our ability, we're not perfect either. Today, however, I want to talk briefly about the list of the acts of the flesh from the Scripture for a couple of reasons. First, because this list of works of the flesh is too often understood as like a new set of laws. Things you can't do or be as Christians, which is not a good interpretation, particularly given the fact that the English words that are there now are actually kind of poor translations of the original Greek. They don't really work real well. Most of the words were referring to pagan practices that have gone long ago, and we just try to find an English word that works. And Paul was definitely not trying to convey here a new set of laws. You do this, you're going to get punished. Like, you break the law, you're done. No. Although it sounds that way. As soon as we start trying to turn these examples into a new set of rules, into new law, we're doing the very things that Paul was trying to get the church not to do. And doing that moves our focus away from the practice of growing spiritual fruit and focuses us back again on the law, on just adopting and following yet another set of fixed rules. Now, following the law is much better than walking in the flesh, for sure. But that's not the point that Paul or that Jesus taught or lived. How could anyone make the mistake of turning this list into a set of laws when the entire letter from Paul is about following the Spirit and about not following the law? But we do that. And it's actually really an easy mistake to make because of the imagery that Paul used when describing the things to be avoided. Paul writes that anyone that does such works of the flesh will not inherit the kingdom of God. Well, that sure sounds like a punishment, doesn't it? Like breaking a law? Yeah. So it's easy. Many Christians make the mistake of reading this list and assuming that Paul is establishing new law. In part, maybe because, well, first off, we too are used to all the laws in the Old Testament as well. But that's not why, if you understand the context of the overall letter, that's not what's going on. For us modern people today, who are not as used to communicating symbolically as ancient people were, the language Paul uses here can come across as legalistic, like crimes and their punishment. Like, if you do these things, your punishment is you're going to hell, you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. But for our modern ears, I think it's probably more helpful for us to hear this message as expressed that if we're focused on the works of the flesh, that means we're probably not focused on the right things. I think that's a better way to understand it. That if we engage in the works of the flesh, in self-absorbed self-dealing, that we're walking away from the Spirit instead of walking towards the Spirit. On the other hand, if you follow Jesus and walk in the Spirit and grow spiritual fruit, you will experience life not always being afraid that you're breaking the rules, no, but experience life as an expression of love, joy, being a peaceful person. Anybody interested in that? But the bigger point being, if you're walking away from the Spirit, turn around. That's all you need to do. If you broke the rules, turn around. Don't just assume you're not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Remember forgiveness? Yeah. When we walk in the Spirit, as Paul describes, we ideally grow to be more and more like Christ. Christ lived in a way that encouraged the growth of spiritual fruit, the growth of love, of joy, of peace. And Paul is doing his level best to try to teach what Christ has taught and how it's changed him. Paul is not setting down a list of laws that will keep you out of heaven. He's giving examples of practices of the ancient world that move people in the wrong direction, that did not support spiritual fruit. Then Paul goes on to describe what to expect when people move in the right direction, on the path towards Christ and towards greater spiritual maturity. Immediately after listing out the works of the flesh, Paul writes this. He says, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And then to make sure we get the point, Paul says, there is no law against such things. Not that Paul wants more laws. He doesn't. Throughout his writings, and not only in his letter to the Galatian church, but also in other letters, Paul emphasizes that that's not what he's about. He doesn't want to set up a new set of improved laws. He wants us to walk in the Spirit the way Jesus walked in the Spirit. Following the law might lead us away from the flesh, from our earthly preoccupations. But it's just a starting point. towards walking in the Spirit. And if that's where you're at, that's okay. It's a valid point along the path. But know that there's more, that there's something deeper within this tradition, within our tradition. The passage we read today, along with the rest of this book of the Bible, which is now in the Bible, Paul's letter to the Galatians, provides some really valuable insight into the spiritual growth process, into what we can expect and aspire to when we follow Jesus and his teachings. That's why I think this is a favorite book for many of us. And this book, or this concept of fruits of the Spirit as opposed to the law, is a big part of why this church exists, how we came to be, and why we still are here today. Paul teaches us that spiritual growth is a process that's available to us as we follow the way, as we follow Christ's teachings. No matter where we are in our spiritual journey, no matter who we are, what stage of life we're in, development, what we're suffering from, or what our attributes might be, these fruits of love, joy, peace, and more are available to each of us. Is that what you're searching for in your life? Paul also provides insight into how we might measure our own spiritual maturity and the spiritual maturity of our church by simply examining our own fruits and the fruits of the community. But it's never about looking down on others. That's not why we evaluate our spiritual maturity, and that's not part of walking in the Spirit. That's another lesson from Paul, that we should strive to grow spiritual fruit, not to judge whether or not people are following the law, not to judge whether or not people are in or out of the kingdom of heaven. That's not our job. We are not the gatekeepers. We are just travelers on the road. Ideally, we're all on a spiritual journey. That's why I'm involved with this church. I can't speak for you. That's what brought me to this place. The purpose of our church is to come together as followers of Christ. And if we're successful in our efforts, as we grow deeper in our relationship with God, we all strive to be more like Christ. As we develop our fruits of the Spirit, we will find that we and others will be nourished by this fruit as we experience life as love, experience life as joy, experience life as peace through Jesus' teachings.